They told us the Omega Speedmaster was the ultimate astronaut's watch, the hero of the moon landing, the champion of NASA's brutal tests. But what if that was not the truth? What if Omega was not NASA's winner, but the CIA's weapon in a silent war of propaganda, espionage, and power? Behind the Moonwatch lies a dark story of contracts, secret deals, and hidden agendas. Tonight, we uncover the dark lie behind the most famous watch in history. Part 1. The official story versus the hidden beginning. The official story is elegant in its simplicity, almost too perfect to doubt. NASA, the vanguard of American space exploration, needed a timepiece that could withstand the unimaginable extremes of outer space. They put forward a brutal series of tests in 1965, and the Omega Speedmaster emerged as the sole survivor. 4 years later, in July 1969, this watch would be strapped to the wrists of the Apollo 11 astronauts who landed on the moon, etching its name into history as the first watch worn beyond Earth. Yet simplicity in history often hides complexity. However, the Speedmaster was not alone in that trial by fire. HoroLuxe submitted its respected chronographs, Longines Wittnauer entered a contender, and Hamilton was invited to participate. These were not minor brands, but titans of horology, names that carried immense prestige and credibility. Yet one by one, they failed to clear the gauntlet that NASA had designed. HoroLuxe cracked under thermal stress, Longines lost accuracy under vibration, and Hamilton was disqualified almost before the tests began because it submitted a pocket chronograph rather than a wristwatch. Omega, and Omega alone, stood at the end of the line. But this is only the surface of the tale. By the way, subscribe and step into the world where a watch is never just a watch. Meanwhile, the NASA test program itself deserves attention because it was no ordinary qualification process. The watches were subjected to searing heat of 93 degrees Celsius, a vacuum close to absolute, humidity that simulated jungle conditions, and vibrations of nearly 9 Gs, mimicking the violence of rocket launch. Under such torture, the HoroLuxe crystals fractured and the Longines hands shifted out of alignment. Yet Omega Speedmaster endured. The narrative of triumph was thus set. Omega was the chosen one, the machine that could master the void. Still, those who examine the archives closely see shadows cast between the lines. What many did not see coming was the curious fact that Omega was not even NASA's first option. Internal documents show that Hamilton was approached first, as an American company seemed an obvious candidate for an American space program. Yet Hamilton's submission was unsuitable, a pocket-sized chronograph rather than a wristwatch, effectively eliminating them before the competition even began. That failure cleared the path for Omega, a Swiss brand whose watches retailed at nearly a third of the price of a Rolex Submariner in the mid-1960s. How then did a mid-tier chronograph costing around $85 leapfrog a brand that symbolized prestige and power? On the other hand, the market context only deepens the mystery. Rolex was synonymous with success and luxury, already the crown of the horological world. Its Submariner was the diver's grail, its GMT Master was the companion of pilots, and its day-date sat on the wrists of presidents. Omega, by contrast, was admired but not revered, respectable but not untouchable. It was a brand that needed validation, not one that defined it. For NASA to elevate it over Rolex raised more questions than it answered. Could it truly have been just the outcome of objective testing? Or was something more subtle at play? Even so, whispers began to circulate within the horological community. Some engineers noted that the speed of Omega's coronation was suspicious, almost predetermined. Letters from 1964 indicate that procurement officers were already leaning towards Omega even before the full test results were compiled. Moreover, Omega's parent company at the time, Société Suisse pour l'Industrie Holographe, was struggling with finances, heavily dependent on government contracts to stabilize its production. A government need met a corporate weakness, and from that fusion a legend was forged. Yet this legend had fingerprints far beyond the engineers' benches in Houston. As a consequence of these converging forces, the Moonwatch was born not solely from endurance under duress, but from circumstance, pressure, and timing. A watch is never just a watch. It is a mirror of politics, economics, and survival. The official story insists the Omega Speedmaster triumphed by virtue alone. The hidden story suggests that virtue had help. And if the help did not come from Houston, one must ask where the decision was truly made. What many did not see coming is that the answer to that question would lead not to the labs of NASA, but to the darker corridors of Washington, where intelligence agencies were already shaping the image of America's space race. Part 2. The Cold War, the CIA, and political weight. The Moonwatch was not simply a piece of gear strapped to a wrist. It was a pawn in the greatest propaganda war of the 20th century, overseen by agencies that dealt in secrets, not seconds. The 1960s were not a decade of quiet progress, but of roaring competition. Every orbit, every rocket, every photograph from space became a weapon in the Cold War. The Soviet Union had struck first with Yuri Gagarin's historic flight in 1961, a mission where the cosmonaut wore a modest Sturmansky wristwatch built in Moscow. That tiny timepiece, unremarkable in design, suddenly became a symbol of Soviet triumph, proof that communism could conquer the skies. As a consequence of this, the United States could not afford to let any detail slip, not even the watch on an astronaut's arm. However, the American response was not guided solely by NASA's engineers. Standing behind them, often unseen, was the Central Intelligence Agency, whose mandate extended far beyond espionage. The CIA monitored aerospace contracts, scrutinized suppliers, and guarded against any vulnerability that could be exploited by the Soviets. If an astronaut's equipment failed, the failure would not just be technical, but symbolic. A propaganda disaster to be broadcast in Pravda the next morning. A watch that stopped ticking in space could become an embarrassment on Earth. Therefore, the CIA's influence extended even into the realm of horology. Meanwhile, Switzerland's peculiar position in the Cold War made it a perfect battleground. Officially neutral, the Swiss were trusted by both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations, supplying watches to soldiers, pilots, and divers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. This neutrality made Swiss watchmaking a safe ground for the United States, but it also demanded careful management. The CIA knew that locking Omega into NASA's program meant securing not just a watch, but an ally in the marketplace of perception. A Swiss brand stamped with NASA approval could embody Western supremacy without raising the suspicion that American politics alone had dictated the choice. But the most surprising thing was not Switzerland's role, but Rolex's exclusion. Rolex by then was the undisputed crown of horology. Its GMT master was favored by Pan Am pilots, its submariner had already achieved cult status among divers and naval officers, and its day date was nicknamed the President's Watch. Yet this crown did not fit the strategy of American intelligence. Rolex was tied to British heritage, structured under the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, and notoriously independent. It was not a brand that could easily be pressured or co-opted into the machinery of US propaganda. Omega, on the other hand, was far more malleable. Even so, Omega's advantage did not lie only in its compliance, but in its dependence. Owned by Société Suisse pour l'Industrie Horloger, the company faced financial turbulence in the mid-1960s and relied heavily on large institutional contracts. For NASA, this meant guaranteed supply and cooperative branding. For the CIA, it meant leverage. A company in need of survival was unlikely to resist political demands. Thus, the Speedmaster's triumph was not just about passing tests, but about aligning with power. The motif returns. A watch is never just a watch, it can be a bargaining chip. As a consequence of this, Omega was granted something extraordinary: the right to use flight qualified by NASA for all manned space missions in its advertising. Historically, NASA was notoriously strict about branding. Equipment was selected for functionality, not for publicity, and suppliers were not encouraged to exploit NASA's name for commercial gain. Yet Omega was allowed almost immediately to trumpet this certification in glossy ads worldwide. That exception alone suggests the involvement of actors far beyond NASA's procurement office. What many did not see coming was how this marketing coup transformed into a propaganda victory. Each advertisement, each photograph of astronauts with Speedmasters on their wrists was not only selling watches but selling an image: America as the nation whose technology could master the cosmos. In reality, the watch was Swiss, but under the banner of NASA, it became a Western artifact, a silent ally in the Cold War narrative. The CIA had secured a watch that could play both sides, neutral in origin but American in story. On the other hand, the consequence of Omega's elevation was the quiet marginalization of rivals. Rolex remained the darling of divers and executives, but it was denied the chance to tie its name to the greatest human achievement of the century. Bulova, an American company, would later complain to Congress that taxpayer dollars were funding a Swiss brand while domestic alternatives were ignored. Yet Omega's position was already cemented, protected not by merit alone, but by the invisible scaffolding of politics and intelligence. Even so, the myth of the Moonwatch continued to grow, feeding on this quiet alignment. The official narrative said Omega was chosen because it was the best. The hidden narrative reveals that it was chosen because it was the most useful to those who wrote the rules of the Cold War. Once again, the myth becomes stronger than the machine. What many did not see coming was that the story of Omega and NASA was only the beginning. The legend would not be secured in laboratories or offices, but on the dusty surface of the moon, in a single photograph that would echo across decades. Part 3. Marketing Myth versus Operational Truth. The Moonwatch legend was not forged in NASA's labs, but in a single image. One photograph turned a simple tool into an eternal icon, while the truth was carefully pushed aside. The moment came on July 20, 1969. Neil Armstrong had just stepped onto the lunar surface, leaving his Omega Speedmaster inside the lunar module to serve as a backup after the onboard timer malfunctioned. Instead, it was Buzz Aldrin who carried his Speedmaster during that historic walk. As a consequence of this twist of fate, Aldrin's watch, reference ST-105.012, became the first wristwatch worn on the moon. That detail, almost accidental, became the cornerstone of Omega's greatest marketing coup. However, the true significance lay not in the mechanics but in the imagery. The photos from Apollo 11 showing Aldrin with his Speedmaster strapped over his bulky spacesuit circulated worldwide. A watch that had retailed for less than $100 suddenly acquired the aura of a relic. Omega seized on this with remarkable speed, launching campaigns that declared the Speedmaster the first watch worn on the moon. The myth was sealed not by engineering reports, but by advertising copy. A watch is never just a watch. It can be a story carved into history. Meanwhile, the astronauts themselves were not bound to Omega once their missions ended. Off-duty, many preferred other brands that reflected their personal tastes rather than institutional choices. Rolex GMT Masters appeared frequently on the wrists of Apollo veterans, valued for their dual-time functionality during international flights. Others wore Bulova Accutrons, whose tuning fork movements symbolized the cutting edge of American technology. The irony was clear. The very men who had made the Speedmaster immortal often chose other watches when they were free to decide. This dissonance between private preference and public symbol reveals how carefully the narrative was managed. But the most surprising challenge came from Bulova, the American rival that refused to stay silent. In the early 1970s, Bulova executives lobbied Congress, arguing that taxpayer money should not be used to promote a Swiss company when an American brand could fulfill the role. They insisted that the Accutron, already used in spacecraft instrument panels, deserved the honor of being on astronauts' wrists as well. The debate reached Capitol Hill, where hearings questioned NASA's procurement choices. Yet despite the noise, Omega's position remained untouched, protected by earlier alignments that went far beyond the merits of the watch itself. Even so, Bulova did not give up entirely. In 1971, during the Apollo 15 mission, astronaut David Scott's Omega crystal popped off after exposure to lunar dust. Faced with a failing timepiece, he switched to a prototype Bulova chronograph he had smuggled aboard, wearing it during his third lunar excursion. Photographic evidence later confirmed this act, revealing that for a few hours, a Bulova, not an Omega, kept time on the moon. Decades later, in 2015, that same Bulova prototype was auctioned for over $1.6 million, a testament to the hunger for alternative stories buried beneath the Omega myth. What many did not see coming was that a single astronaut's quiet decision could shake a half-century narrative. By the way, subscribe to reveal the untold history behind the world's most iconic timepieces. On the other hand, Omega continued to dominate the official story. Through the 1970s and 1980s, every NASA mission reinforced the Speedmaster's reputation, regardless of what astronauts wore in private. Advertisements repeated the same phrase, "Flight quantified by NASA for all manned space missions," until it became a mantra. The myth becomes stronger than the machine, because repetition transforms accident into destiny. Omega's financial survival, already fragile in the quartz crisis, was bolstered by this constant association with the moon. The watch was no longer simply a chronograph, it was an emblem of human achievement. As a consequence of this relentless myth-making, the public came to believe that the Speedmaster was chosen solely because it was the best. Few remembered the failures of HoroLuxe or the lobbying of Bulova. Fewer still questioned whether political considerations had shaped the decision. Instead, consumers bought into the narrative, purchasing not just a watch, but a fragment of the moon itself. The marketing triumph was so absolute that even rival brands began to reference the Moonwatch indirectly, conceding Omega's ownership of that symbolic territory. Even so, the cracks in the legend remained visible to those who looked closely. Astronaut memoirs mentioned personal watches tucked into flight bags. Collectors whispered about prototypes that never saw the light of day. And every now and then, an auction revealed a forgotten piece of history, such as Aldrin's lost Speedmaster, which mysteriously vanished after the Apollo 11 mission and has never been recovered. Each of these details reminds us that the story is not as simple as Omega's glossy ads suggest. What many did not see coming was that the myth would outgrow reality, transforming the Moonwatch into something larger than a timepiece. It became propaganda, heritage, and luxury rolled into one, a tool weaponized by history itself. Yet the most striking revelation is still to come, because the Moonwatch's true legacy lies not in space, but in the way intelligence and politics turned a simple chronograph into an enduring cultural weapon. Part 4. Legacy, Lies, and the Weaponization of Time. Today, the Omega Speedmaster Professional is marketed not merely as a chronograph, but as living heritage. Boutique windows present it as the Moonwatch, a direct descendant of the timepiece worn on the lunar surface in 1969. Retail prices sit in the multi-thousand range for the classic version, while limited editions climb far higher at major auctions, where provenance is a second movement beating under the dial. Collectors treat it as a sacred relic, and Omega curates exhibitions around its lunar legend. Yet behind the polished steel and sapphire lies a truth rarely spoken, because prestige can be rooted in propaganda as much as performance. However, when examined as a Cold War artifact, the Speedmaster reveals a different face. It was not chosen solely for technical merit, though it endured NASA's trials. It was elevated because it served American political needs and intelligence strategies. The CIA, always present in the shadows, understood that symbolism mattered as much as substance in the space race. By ensuring that Omega carried the NASA seal, the agency secured a cultural weapon that looked like a tool. A watch is never just a watch, it can be a message worn on the wrist. Meanwhile, HoroLuxe, the brand that could have claimed the moon, found itself locked outside this symbolic conquest. HoroLuxe thrived elsewhere. Its submariner owned the seas, its GMT master navigated the skies, and its day-date ruled the corridors of power. Even so, it missed the chance to tie its crown to humanity's greatest voyage, and that absence sculpted its future differently. The result was paradoxical. HoroLuxe dominated earthbound prestige, while Omega monopolized the heavens of memory. The crown seated a battlefield, and Omega won a throne built of stardust. But the most surprising outcome was how thoroughly Omega leveraged this inheritance when the quartz crisis arrived. In the 1970s and 80s, as digital accuracy humiliated mechanical pride, the Moonwatch narrative kept the brand's soul intact. Advertisements leaned on mythology rather than microtolerances, because myths do not seize up under shock or corrode in salt. The myth becomes stronger than the machine when people buy the story first and the object second. And the Speedmaster story never needed batteries to glow. Even so, the legend needed fresh oxygen, and it arrived from drama rather than triumph. After Apollo 13's near disaster in 1970, Omega received NASA's Silver Snoopy Award for timing that helped the crew execute a critical burn. The image of a cartoon beagle floating on a patch became a new emblem of precision under pressure. And decades later, special editions turned that patched gratitude into retail gravity. As a consequence of this recycling of meaning, the Speedmaster could renew itself without rewriting the past, grafting fresh symbolism onto the same lunar trunk. On the other hand, the institutional bond deepened again when NASA re-qualified the Speedmaster for the Space Shuttle era in the late 1970s. New tests, new paperwork, same conclusion. The watch remained on flight manifests, even as cockpit electronics advanced beyond anything the Apollo crews had imagined. The persistence mattered more than the specs, because continuity itself became part of the aura. The certification stamp was no longer a technical passport, but a priestly anointing, and the public read it like scripture. Such continuity fortifies legend more than torque figures ever could. Even so, Omega also chased future symbolism with the Speedmaster X33 in the 1990s, a titanium digital analog hybrid purpose-built for astronauts and pilots. The X33 spoke fluent checklist, yet the market still craved the rasp of a hand-wound caliber and the look of Hesselite against stars. The lesson was unmistakable. The past out-communicated the future. As a consequence, the professional remained the halo, while the experimental variants became footnotes that proved the rule. Heritage eclipses novelty when the myth is intact. Meanwhile, inside museums and vaults, the story was monetized with curatorial precision. Omega's Alaska prototypes, oversized cases and red thermal shells designed to fight lunar temperature swings, migrated from workshop curiosities to exhibition centerpieces. Auction rooms began to treat reference numbers like chapter headings, and hammer prices rose with every rediscovered photograph, flight plan, or strap fragment. Provenance turned ephemera into equity, because documentation is the alchemy that converts steel into myth. In this marketplace, paperwork weighs more than metal. But the most surprising reinforcement of the legend came from absence rather than presence. Buzz Aldrin's Apollo 11 Speedmaster vanished in transit after the mission and has never been recovered. And that vacuum behaves like gravity for collectors. The missing watch became a black hole of speculation, pulling attention toward the pieces that remained. Even so, when David Scott's Belova prototype surfaced decades later and sold for an eye-watering sum, it proved that counter-stories have a market too. The Moonwatch monopoly was never absolute. It was simply better narrated. As a consequence of this narrative supremacy, generations of buyers came to see the Speedmaster not as a mid-priced chronograph that caught a break, but as the embodiment of human achievement itself. They pay not merely for a caliber with lateral clutch and camp-switched chronograph, but for the promise embedded in grainy footage and the hush of a control room counting down. They strap on Aldrin's walk, Armstrong's absent wrist, and NASA's silent blessing, and in doing so, they purchase an identity. Power on the wrist stops being metaphor and becomes a daily ritual. On the other hand, the unresolved question remains whether intelligence actively engineered the watch's ascent or merely shepherded it when convenient. Declassified files may never reveal footnotes about dials and gaskets, yet the anomalies stand in plain sight. A Swiss brand granted unprecedented marketing rights, an American rival rebuffed on Capitol Hill, a narrative that mirrored Cold War priorities too perfectly to be luck. Whether orchestration or opportunism, the alignment is undeniable, because the outcome served all the right masters at once. Alignment that neat seldom happens by chance. Even so, the Moonwatch's greatest achievement is not surviving space, but surviving time. It crossed from tool to icon, from instrument to relic, from functional object to cultural weapon. The object keeps time, the myth keeps meaning, and meaning compels loyalty across generations who never smelled rocket fuel. The mechanism can be serviced by a watchmaker. The narrative is serviced by anniversary editions, museum tours, and careful guardianship of archives. The machine needs oil, but the legend needs oxygen, and Omega learned how to provide both. What many did not see coming is the final turn of the screw. The Speedmaster no longer has to prove anything in laboratories, because it already proved everything in memory. The watch's movement beats at a steady rate, but the story's cadence accelerates with every retelling, every limited run, every documentary voice that whispers the same promise with new emphasis. In that sense, the Moonwatch is not just a watch, it is a carefully constructed story that turned history into a balance sheet and secrecy into shareholder value.